a lot of people in the U.S. and me included, we heard about the Brexit.
Yeah.
And, it was painted as a negative thing, as a racist thing, and so forth. But I don't fully understand it. And I think a lot of my viewers don't understand it either. So from your point of view, as a black person from the UK, explain the significance of the Brexit.
Right. So I actually wrote an article about this, but there are very valid reasons to criticize the EU. Yeah. But Britain, for me, is not the country that's in the position often to make these criticisms. What do I mean by that? So Britain's been involved in more foreign wars than other powers within the EU in recent years. We lock up our population about twice the rate that the Germans do. Other countries in Europe are closing prisons, Britain's opening more. We have one of the widest social inequalities in the whole of Europe. We have almost the lowest educational attainment. In many ways, Britain is the America of Europe, not in a rude way, but in the sense that America is a very divided, socially, racially unequal society. Britain is the closest to that often in Europe, and France, but France is a bit more complex, and I don't know as much about French politics. But on many indices, Britain ranks the bottom of the barrel, or close to the bottom of the barrel, considering it's one of the powerhouses of European economics. Instead of focusing on the valid criticisms of the EU that they could have focused on, whatever they felt that they may be, the corporatocracy of the EU, it's not like it was some... But the problem was the people who were leading it were not in... The things that are there to be criticised about the EU, they don't have a problem with. So instead of that, they focused wholly on the issue of immigration, which was completely stupid because the EU does not determine Britain's law on immigration, as was admitted once Brexit was over. So the whole tone of the debate came to be around the fear of black and brown immigrants coming through Europe into the UK. At this point, of course, thousands of them have been dying in the Mediterranean year in, year out, trying to flee wars that Britain has partly been involved in and France has partly been involved in. So a lot of people in the UK saw very clearly that while there could have been a different campaign, the way it played out was wholly, almost entirely about immigration. And as many people, despite the fact that many scholars pointed out the immigration issue was irrelevant to the EU, a whole bunch of other lies were told. We were told that the 350 million spent on the EU could go on the NHS. The day after the vote happened, it was like, oh no, sorry, that money can't be spent on the NHS. Sorry about that, that was a mistake. So it really just whipped up a whole sense of fervour. The day after the vote, loads of people went to work and who were foreigners, who were told, no, you need to get your passport and go home. Became a kind of, it revamped a sort of virulent, white nationalist, anti-immigrant fervour in Britain. And what was sad is even a lot of black and Asian people started engaging in, but the foreigners, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at what the stats bore out, it's revealing. 75% of black people voted to stay. That's the highest of any ethnic group. Is that what? Because black people just love the EU because we're completely unaware of Europe's relationship to Africa? No. There's obviously something else going on. And then non-black people of colour were the next group. And even if you look by age, the older people were much more likely to vote to leave, younger people were much more likely to vote to stay. People who lived in multicultural areas almost exclusively voted to stay. People who lived in wholly white areas almost exclusively voted to leave, with the exception of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Even though they don't have a lot of multiculturalism, Scotland particularly is socially a more progressive country than England. Not one district in Scotland voted to leave. The whole of Scotland voted to stay. So you had all of these divisions that were exposed within British society. While you have obviously exceptions to the rule, you had some people that voted Brexit because of their belief that there was a kind of socially progressive way to leave the EU, which is nonsense, really, from where we are as a country now. You had some people of every political persuasion vote every way, but the general stats afterwards bore out what this was about. 80% of the people who voted to leave felt that immigration was a bad thing. But I mean, something like 71% of them on the Lord Ashcroft polls believe that the internet's a bad thing. So, I mean, I don't know how seriously you can take that.
Well, right after the Brexit passed, the Prime Minister resigned, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the Prime Minister resigned. The dude who led the campaign, Nigel Farage, resigned from his post as the head of UKIP. And the former London Mayor, Boris Johnson, also wouldn't take the reins, and he was one of the leaders. So basically, like, everyone kicked up a fuss. Everyone said we need to leave, maybe thinking it wasn't going to happen. Then once the vote went through, everyone kind of jumped ship, which says a lot about their confidence in the post-Brexit future. The Prime Minister, to be fair to him, I have millions of other criticisms of him, but he was pro staying in the EU. That doesn't necessarily, like I said, there's a bad case for staying in the EU, and lots of people who want to stay in the EU because it helps them exploit places in the global south better. So I'm not saying that like the EU is perfect. It certainly is not. I'm just saying that at this point in British history, the way the vote played out, there was no way to have a socially responsible exit from the EU because the whole thing had been fought on the grounds of race. And anyone who tells you different is lying. The whole media campaign at the time was about funny brown people maybe coming in.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's like Obama just quitting midterm. It's the equivalent.
Him quitting are in the middle of a term after one of the most significant decisions in the country's history. And now we have an unelected person in power in a democratic society. Surely if the Prime Minister resigns, there should be another election, but that's just me being idealistic. So British politics right now are very tumultuous, very difficult, very challenging. There's a lot of divisions in the society, and it is interesting in its own way to see how it's going to play out.
Well, is there, in the US, there's a president, a vice president, something, if the president resigns or quits or gets impeached, like Nixon got, the vice president steps in. Is there a vice prime minister?
I don't think so. I don't know how they decided Theresa May would be the person who replaced David Cameron, because I think the talk was Boris Johnson might be that person. Then there was a talk that Michael Gove might be that person. And then it ended up being this woman, Theresa May. How they came to that decision, I didn't actually follow, to be honest. But she wasn't the vice prime minister.
Yeah, I remember the stock market kind of trembled afterwards, but then within about a week, everything kind of went back to normal. Is there really a massive effect of the Brexit in the UK right now, or not really?
No, let's be clear. We haven't exited the EU. We've just made a vote. The public referendum is just the public giving an indication to the government of what they'd like to do, legally. It's not legally binding. Until the government invokes this thing called Article 51, we haven't actually left the EU. We're still in the EU. What we are is in this position of limbo, where no one knows whether we're in or out. So a lot of business people, it's hard for them to plan for the future or whatever else. I don't think anyone credible was really saying if Britain left the EU, that Britain was going to become, one of the poorest countries in the world overnight. Some people came with this Armageddon stuff that basically undermined what could have been a credible case. Britain is going to be all right. Britain owns enough stuff around the world that for now, Britain will maintain, being a wealthy country. A lot of centuries of exploitation, some industrial pioneering, and many other things. Britain is not going to become a poor country anytime soon. However, I do fear that if Britain does fully leave, in terms of if you look at Britain and America's politics, birds of a feather have been flocking together for a minute. In terms of their foreign policy, together, a lot of the disasters of the last 10 or 15 years, Britain and America have been heavily engaged in together, obviously most notably in Iraq. And I worry that if Britain leaves the EU, there's no counterweight. In fact, some of the major powers in the EU were against the Iraq invasion, most notably Germany and France. Now, of course, they would be pro other invasions, but I suppose the point is when you're in a council with a larger group of people, you have to, at least on surface, pretend to take their opinions on account. I know that doesn't always play out in the UN. America has veto power in the UN, so everyone else can think whatever they want to think, and we'll veto it anyway. So I think that I just think that it's the tone of the way the debate was fought that doesn't bode well for the future of the country, particularly for people of colour in the country. And a lot of people, I think, a lot of what's happening now a lot in the UK, which is interesting, a lot of black and brown folks who have done well, which there is quite a few, there's just not a community of them that live in one place, are just like, I'm going to go back to India. I'm going to go back to Jamaica. I'm going to go back to Ghana. I don't feel welcome here. And there's a reverse brain drain almost, where a lot of successful, particularly in India, as India's becoming more and more wealthy country, a lot of Indians are like, why am I going to stay here where I'm made to feel like an immigrant, even though I've been here, 70, 80 years, even though my grandparents fought in both world wars for Britain, etc. I'll just go back to India. And so that's an interesting way in which it's, I think, going to harm Britain that people are not even aware of, where people are just like, I'll just go home.
What do you think about the whole situation?
Man, my point of view, man, I really feel like they tried to paint a bad picture on my brother and tried to make him look like he was a hater. It was some envy, jealousy type shit, you know what I'm saying? And actuality, you know what I'm saying? Bro been having this shit, man. He been in the condo.
I got my hat on and I had my Coke bottles up under my hat. And I'm sitting at the dinner table like an asshole with the hat on, knowing she gonna tell me to take it off. And I'm just sitting there just gawping down, in my zone. She said, take that goddamn hat off at the dinner table. I'm like, come on, Mom. Coke everywhere.